welcome back to the Movement Professional podcast. So today I have a special guest that we're looking to do a movement psychology series here. So I'm with Meghan Morley, and I met Meghan at StrongFirst Elite certification. She's a very strong woman, but she's also I think you're a psychologist and a counselor. Is that what?
So I'm a licensed professional counselor.
Okay, licensed professional counselor. So I'll let you do your intro of like what you're doing now, but kind of the connection between psychology and movement.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, my name is Meghan Morley. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Pennsylvania, which, for lack of a better term, that means I'm a licensed therapist. There's a bunch of different designations out there, but I'm a licensed therapist. And also a personal trainer and a strength coach, as Chris said, in terms of StrongFirst, and work as a personal trainer here in Philadelphia. But I'm also the owner of Cognitive Pursuits, which is a private practice that focuses on athletes and other high achieving individuals, both in the academic and professional realms, that want to improve their mental health, but also in many cases improve their mental performance, and kind of looking at both sides of that. So excited to be here to talk with you today about how these topics intersect. And
yes. Yeah, so I know when I saw that you had started the business on Instagram, and I was really excited about that because I just feel like it's such a missing link in my career to have that collaboration with someone that's dealing with the psychology realm but also knows movement. And I think it's popping up more and more in physical therapy that we're dealing with movement, but we're also, for the most part, dealing with chronic pain. That's what people come in, and that's their major complaint. And the research is just more and more clear that we need to approach things more from a biopsychosocial model, which we have to understand the biomechanics, but we really, really have to understand the psychology and the behavioral and social elements to it. And I just, that wasn't a big part of our education, but it's something that we have to deal with every day. So to me, there's this need for collaboration, and we both have to speak somewhat of the same language. So I was excited to have this conversation. We've already had a conversation about, where we sort of meet in the middle, and we have our own individual scopes, but where the interplay exists. So in your experience, like being a trainer and, dealing with the clients that you deal with, like, how do you find that your expertise really like bleeds into your personal trainer experience?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because, I think the main area, and I think something we're going to talk about today, is how do I talk with folks about motivation? How do I talk with them about consistency? I think that's where most of my, therapy knowledge comes in. I think all personal trainers at times feel like our clients' therapists, because we get to know our clients really well. They talk to us about their lives. And yes, I have some special skills that help me listen to them in certain ways and make them feel heard and things like that. But at the end of the day, when I'm really thinking about what skills that I'm putting into play with them, not as their therapist, but as their personal trainer, it's coming from kind of the perspective of, how can we make sure that you're being consistent in this? How are we making sure that this is a part of your life long term and not just for the short term? Things like that. I think that's really where my background in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is my primary modality, and also positive psychotherapy kind of come into play when I'm working with my personal training clients.
Perfect. Yeah. And I think, it's so often that whether we're dealing with people from a rehab perspective or just like general fitness perspective, that it is about behavioral modification, about like, how do you get people to do the things that you want them to do? It's really not just having people come in, pay you for your time, and then totally forget about, what happened in the session after you leave. So a big part of our job is really to be able to teach people what we know gradually over time, and get them to have more self-efficacy in their fitness and their health process. But that could be a very difficult thing. And it's, because we tend to be so specialized, I think, in school, it's like we don't really approach it from that perspective. Like, I know, like in physical therapy, we tend to approach it from the perspective of like finding out the diagnosis and trying to have a treatment for it. But if we can't get people to follow up and do the treatment, then it doesn't matter what we do. It becomes kind of useless. So it ends up boiling down to, we really have to have skills to be able to get people to buy in and think about it as a lifelong process.
Absolutely. And that, that makes me think about one of the main things, one of the main tenets of goal setting when we talk about psychotherapy, but I think is important both in personal training and probably in PT, you can speak to this, is how do we make sure the goals are framed in terms of the client's values?
Yes.
If the goal doesn't feel like it's in alignment with their values, then they're not going to stick with it. That's why, as a personal trainer, I don't really set weight loss goals.
Right.
Because if we're being real about it, people's values aren't to be quote unquote skinny.
Right.
But if I can reframe that, maybe it's a parent that needs to pick up their child on a regular basis, or anything in their life, or a sport that they would like to play long term, whether it be tennis or golf or whatever it is in their life. If I can reframe the goal to be in alignment with their values, then I'm going to get a much higher level of compliance with whatever I ask them to do, and also buy in and a lot less second guessing of what the plan is. If I can align that, that's something we also do in therapy is, okay, great, you came to therapy because you want X, Y, or Z to happen in your life. Let's reframe that in terms of a goal that's going to speak to your values, so that you keep coming back. And also, and I'm sure this is important for PT, I'll let you speak to it, but do the work you need to do between now and the next time I see you. Because it's one thing to come and show up with me for an hour and chat. It's another thing to put those tools and skills and insights into practice in your daily life to really see that progress that we're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I see in PT is that you often have to reframe the goal to make it a little bit more objective. Because a lot of times the goals become like, I just want to be out of pain. Or even from a fitness side, I will see people that will, like, their first goal will be they want to lose weight, or they want to have some type of aesthetic goal. But then we have to appreciate that, like, that is too general, too broad. Like we don't have any ways of looking at measuring progress with that. So especially from a pain perspective, like, we're not, directly dealing with like taking people's pain away in that moment, right? There's too many variables that go into pain that any one individual can actually like 100% guarantee that they're going to take pain away. But what we can do is look at some of the things that tend to be involved in the research of decreasing pain and improving function. So I often have to change the goal a little bit to say, okay, if you were stronger, and we would look at stronger would mean that you can lift more weight, you can do these things that hold value for you. Would you feel like your life is better than it is now? Would you likely feel like you're also in less pain, even if the pain is still present, but you're doing more than you're doing now? Would that be a better life? Because I think sometimes like people get lost in this idea that they have to be in a pain-free situation, or there wasn't success with what they're doing. And that search for pain-free, I think it's a misnomer of how physiology works in many ways. So there does need to be this reframing of like, what's the most direct thing we can handle in these sessions? Well, it's moving you forward from a movement and a function perspective. So that has to become the goal more, and then the pain will be something we work around and we use and we're curious about in that process.
No, absolutely. And that's sometimes what I frame is the difference between a wish and a goal. The wish is to be out of pain, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with wishing and being hopeful. And believe me, in therapy, we are all about, instilling hope and making people, optimistic for the future. But that's a wish. That's not necessarily a goal. And as you're saying, that more objective, that frame, like, how can we separate those two things for you to make you a little bit more productive?
I love that. I feel like I've thought that, but haven't said it out loud. It's a great phrase. Yeah, and I think you could probably speak to also like with the weight loss goals, it becomes like a similar thing, right? Where it's just like, yeah, it's a very important thing for health in many cases to lose weight, but we have to have now the actual like direct behaviors to get there that we can actually have some control over, right? So like we have less control over saying like, you're going to lose weight, but we have more control over saying, okay, we can make you stronger, and this is what strength looks like objectively. We can give you more endurance. This is what endurance looks like objectively. We can have you change your nutrition, not and try not to moralize nutrition, but just to change it and look at it and be mindful of it, so that we can make adjustments to it. I think that's with nutrition, it becomes this like, what's the right way to eat for me to lose weight, as opposed to it's like, well, you're not monitoring anything yet. So if you're not monitoring anything yet, we don't know. We don't have any baselines. Like with movement, we would hopefully have some baselines on a first session so we know where people are starting. I think with nutrition, we often like miss that. We just go to the thing that we're hearing about is like that's the best thing to do. But as we start monitoring more things, now that nutrition doesn't become good or bad. It becomes more, okay, we have benchmarks that we can see change, and we could be testing them. So you become your own N is one scientific experiment to see if like, all right, are we moving towards your goal or are we moving farther away from it? So I think, again, it's all about taking this broad wish and then putting very specific, actions behind it that can be manipulated over time.
Absolutely. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk a lot about giving credit and having opportunities for celebration and noticing when things are moving in the direction that we want them to. And that doesn't mean being toxically positive or
Right.
reaching for those things, but having moments to celebrate. And when the goal is weight loss or pain-free, there are very few moments where you get to celebrate.
Right.
All of those things that you mentioned before, every 5 pounds on the deadlift can be a celebration. Then
Absolutely.
every, small change that you make with your water consumption becomes a moment for celebration and to take credit for the work that you're putting in. And we cannot understate that when we talk about motivation and drive, because without opportunities to feel effective in what you're doing, what's the point in keeping on at that point?
Absolutely, like 100%. And yeah, I think that that's so valuable that to continue to give these small victories in different places, but that the reframing is so key there, right? Where like right away, and that's why I like the movement environment, because a lot of times you can listen to the story that a patient or a client has, but if the story is not necessarily helpful, you don't necessarily even have to correct it. You just have to get people moving. And the movement itself demonstrates what someone can and can't do in any moment. And then it's very obvious when they're doing more than when they did coming in, right? So you just have to have enough communication to make sure that they feel what they're doing in any moment is safe enough to continue to go forward. But they could, you don't have to correct a line of thinking with movement. It's like the progressive progress that's being made with strength and endurance and fitness tends to start to change the thinking in itself. So I think sometimes without that movement, it's really hard to make changes there.
Yeah, the evidence speaks for itself.
Right.
It's right there on the barbell. It's right there on the kettlebell. You can see it right in front of you. Yeah, absolutely.
And certainly something I've learned, and I'm continuing to learn over the years, is to say less and just get people moving, right? Like, because, we have conversations with other professionals, we learn things in continuing ed, and you sort of want to just pass what you've learned on, and you can definitely overwhelm. And really, like, you don't need to do that at first. You can have in the back of your head, like, where you want to go and what you want to see changed over time, but you don't have to share it all in the first session. And especially when you have the opportunity to get people to move more, sometimes it could be detrimental. It gets in the way of like what you're actually trying to get them to do.
Yeah, definitely. As one of the biggest differences between my job as a personal trainer and my job as a psychotherapist is that as a personal trainer, my job is technically to give advice.
Right.
As a therapist, we do not give advice. That's not our role. We help lead people to their own answers. We help lead people, and we may, offer skills and education and things like that, but it's not my job to give advice. And I think that's one of the things that I do take from my background as a therapist into the personal training world, because somebody's coming to you as a personal trainer saying, teach me. But as you're saying, they don't need every little bit of that. And they probably learn more from that question, that personal trainer question. How did that feel?
Right.
And then coming back and, reporting how that felt, and then, making adjustments from there. So I definitely take your point. I think it's one of the things that definitely is separate as, in my two roles, but, I've definitely taken as a psychotherapist that economy of words, so to speak.
And one of the things from our conversation we had a couple of months ago that I really took from it, and I think you mentioned it as a compliment, that I seem to ask a lot of questions, but I don't know that I do. And ever since we had that conversation, I was definitely in that frame of mind a lot more, is like, how can this be framed as a question more than instruction? And like the value that it's hard to do sometimes, but like when there's a mindfulness there and you do reframe into a question, it does seem to be so much more successful for one, getting to actually see where your client is at, right? So there could be assumptions made where you think you know where they're at, so you're adding an instruction, but you're totally off what your assumption is of where they're at, and they might not be ready for that instruction. Where when you ask the question, you actually get a better idea of like what they're ready to hear from an instruction standpoint, because whatever their response back is gives you more information about where they're at.
No, absolutely. And what's going on outside of the gym,
Right,
what's going on
right.
outside of the PT studio,
Exactly.
and how that's influencing what we're doing together. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you mentioned some of the methods that you tend to use the most would be cognitive behavioral therapy, which I did a little bit of work with that because I found that to be one of the more fascinating things. When I did precision nutrition, I think a lot of precision nutrition was based on cognitive behavioral therapy. That's the first time I ever heard the term. And then I took a course online through the Beck Institute, but very, so I'm just kind of very on the surface. So I'd love to hear, like how do you utilize that with your clients? If you can give some like examples of things that you've really helped people with, but how would you use cognitive behavioral therapy to help out?
Sure. Yeah. And almost all of my training in cognitive behavioral therapy also comes through the Beck Institute.
Right.
So great resource. And I loved when we had our conversation to hear that you had taken that measure to do that, because I do think a lot of wellness professionals could benefit from some of those skills. And really, it just kind of as a really brief overview, cognitive behavioral therapy basically believes that our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors are all connected. And if you can change one, then the other two variables will also change, and that they are interconnected in that way. We also believe in cognitive behavioral therapy that, and this is very important, it's the cognitive model, which is, it is not the situation excuse me, that makes us think, feel, or behave a certain way. It is our perception of the situation that makes us think, feel, or behave in a certain way. And that is very important when we're talking about all of these things, whether it be mental health, fitness, whatever it is, to understand that it is not the situation. It is the way we are viewing the situation and the lens through which we are viewing that situation that really affects us. So with that kind of in mind, some of the major things that have helped clients of mine in both domains, one is something that is cognitive behavioral in nature, but it is the WHOOP protocol. Have you ever heard of that? It's Gabrielle Oettingen's work. Psychologist Gabrielle Oettingen developed this protocol known as WHOOP, and it's based in the cognitive model, but basically it's this idea that we can't just think about wanting a goal and expect our motivation to rise. We have to take further steps to make sure that we're going to. And for her, those steps are wish, outcome, obstacle, plan. And this is something I go through with clients of mine in psychotherapy, but also a little bit more loosely and in a less structured way with my personal training clients. It's like, you have this wish, and I used that as a not so great term, but she means it as a true full formed goal.
Right.
Then you need to be able to see what the outcome is going to do for you. Why does it matter? And again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about values based. What's the point of achieving this goal? What will be better about your life if you achieve this goal? And then is the most important part. Then you need to identify the obstacles. What's going to get in the way? If we sugarcoat the journey, as I say, cognitive behavioral therapy is not the power of positive thinking. That is a misnomer. It is the power of helpful, adaptive thinking.
Right.
And so if I identify the obstacles, if I take the moment to step back and say, what is going to get in the way? Is it going to be my schedule? Is it going to be my actual motivation? Do I actually even care about this goal? Do I need to go back a step? Is it going to be an injury I might have had in the past? Do I need to involve another wellness professional? Whatever it is, I need to identify those obstacles, and then I need to develop a plan for each of those. How am I going to work with or to overcome this obstacle in order to continue to meet my goals. And that's when you see motivation increase. If we just wish for it, there's
Right.
this crazy thing that happens in our brain that makes us think we've already achieved it.
Yes.
And then motivation goes down. But if
Right.
we take the moment to kind of give ourselves a little reality check and actually plan for it, we see motivation really rise. And that's one of the things that I think is really helpful when it comes to behavioral consistency.
I love it. I love it. Like any of those acronyms, I feel like are awesome. They really help you kind of develop a system there. And to me, like, I guess before I took any venture into looking into psychology or anything, like, I think there was always this idea that it was very like kind of nebulous, esoteric. Like there was no structure, right? It was just like you're talking your problems out, and that's all you needed. And I think for a lot of people, that's a deterrent because they're thinking of it as like, I don't need to do that, but not appreciating that there's like a real structure behind a lot of these models that are, just like there's a structure to physical fitness, that you're gradually adapting yourself to some type of stimulus in some way, like, or you're kind of getting yourself used to something gradually over time. And you can't overwhelm, but you also have to make sure you don't avoid, right? So that there's sort of this in between, but that like professionals really have like good systems behind this. And I think for me that definitely helps, like just the way that my mind works. Like I've started to really look at some of these psychology models as just different ways that the body adapts, like we would think about it from a physical standpoint. We just have to have different exercises that we're doing or different stimuluses that we're bringing into the picture. But I do think that that's quite helpful. And acronyms sometimes seem like cheesy, but they really help. Like are you familiar with, I'm sure you are, the positive psychology acronym PERMA, right?
Yes,
So like that one really like stuck with me. I put
it's
it
a
in
great one.
my first book, just because like it was such a, like the acronym itself is just a bunch of broad categories that you then can have a practice to
Yes.
build some of the values of those broad categories. But it's also like a really easy way to help somebody get into looking into a topic a little bit more, right? And I think that becomes quite useful there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things that you had just said a moment ago that I just want to highlight
Mm,
is about how many goals you have.
mm,
You said you don't want to overwhelm, but you also don't want, you know what I mean? That piece, that's really important when it comes to the WHOOP protocol too, is that, notice that it's about one goal at a time. And not that you can't have more than one goal at a time, but you need to have a plan for each of those
right.
goals. And a lot of time we're just, we have these just many, many goals at the same time, and then we're not planning for any of them, or we're having these kind of really general plans that don't really focus enough on any of them. And that's really unhelpful to humans committing to something.
I remember when I was writing my book, like I had heard that piece of information that if you talk about something and it's like your brain already thinks you've done it, and it
Yeah, you get the
actually makes
reward
you, yeah,
pathway.
you get less motivation. And I remember that I'm like, I'm gonna stop telling people I'm writing a book and just write the damn thing, right? And it really mattered because I would like finish a page or something, and I would be telling people, yeah, I'm writing a book. It's like, one, that they don't care, but it was, I don't know, it was just like something, because I was putting all this work into it. I felt like I had to like tell someone about it, but it also made me feel like I was doing more than I was doing, where just like having a plan and sticking to the plan. And then, when the book's actually done, then it's like, now you market the book. But there was
Mhm.
something that was like, my brain was calling me to like tell people about it, but it was like almost a way for me to feel like I did more than I did. It was bizarre, but I had heard something like that. I think it was a book I was listening to, and I was like, oh, that's a game changer. All right, I'm gonna like zip it a little bit about telling people what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I mean, that's also a good piece about accountability, right? And
Mm-hmm.
accountability partners. We hear a lot about that in fitness, and like your accountability community. And there's nothing wrong with a little bit of accountability and
Right.
telling people what you're doing and sharing your positive moments. But accountability is not a cheerleading group.
Right.
Accountability is also sharing what are the obstacles going on? How far am I really getting in this book? Just to use that as an
Yeah.
example, how many pages have I really written? And I think it's great. I see sometimes in these communities and accountability spaces, people celebrating other people's victories. And that's, again, beautiful and wonderful. And we need that positive feedback in our lives. But those spaces also, if they're going to be effective, need to be a safe space to also offer when things are not going well, when things are more difficult, when obstacles are popping up, and a space to, if you want to problem solve as a group, great. If not, just a space to be able to share those things, to again, not be too rooted in positive thinking, but
Right.
in helpful thinking.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things I find that I have some difficulty with as a clinician sometimes, is like being able to kind of go from targeting people in a direction that I think would be valuable for them, but also then backtracking a little bit into more of like an empathetic, just like, all right, we don't have to move anything forward now. Let me just listen. Right. And it can be really hard to do that, especially like in a movement perspective, where I might even come off cold or like not sympathetic, where I'm really just like, okay, I'm listening to you, but like, this is the next thing we have to do. And when it's appropriate to like not do a next thing, right, and just listen that day, or things like that, and just, or try to like speak less and just listen more. I feel like the longer I work with the same people, I miss the boat there sometimes, and I regret that afterwards.
Yeah, no, I hear that. There's a lot of pressure, as a movement professional, to use every moment of the 60 minutes or the 50
Right.
minutes, whatever it is, to squeeze as much out of the orange as possible. But
Yeah.
sometimes, as you were saying, that's not necessarily the most helpful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. So I think, good starting conversation. Anything that we haven't covered that you want to add, as far as, some of the work that you do that would tie into the exercise realm, or nutrition, sleep, anything in the health perspective?
Yeah, there's one other piece that I thought tied in with kind of everything we were talking about today, and there's so many models and things in cognitive therapy that we could talk about, and hopefully we will in the future. But one of the things that I think as is super important in the world we live in today is to be watching out for what we call all or nothing thinking,
Mm-hmm.
whether I'm being a therapist in that moment, whether I'm a personal trainer, especially probably in the PT space, of everything is either perfect or it's terrible. It is either good or bad. We brought that up a little bit earlier with
Mm-hmm.
nutrition, right or wrong. That all or nothing thinking is a motivational trap, because if it's bad, then it's all bad, and then why am I still doing this?
Right.
And
Right.
that's where people give up. And as a therapist, we do something called Socratic questioning, which is probably like too in depth for this moment, but taking time to evaluate for ourselves as the person, or the client, or for ourselves as the client, let's say, for a
Mm-hmm.
moment, is like, is this truly all good or all bad? Is there another way to look at this? Am I missing the gray area in this? Can I point out for myself what's going well and what are the setbacks, and reframe those in maybe a whoop type model, reframe those in a problem solving model, and asking ourselves, like, is this really even helpful for me to be thinking this way? And looking for that all or nothing thinking as coaches, but also with ourselves as individuals, makes a really big difference in trying to combat some of that perfectionism that is so rampant in our world, and that really does stop people from pursuing their goals, even just starting. So
Absolutely. I think that that's a beautiful like discussion point there, because that's one of the things with movement that you see it all the time, where like there's good exercises and bad exercises, and it's actually, I think, a selling point for a lot of fitness professionals, as you see, where it's like they're trying to put themselves in a position where like they have all the answers, and that somebody is hurting you by doing something wrong or something dangerous. And I often get, almost like people are surprised that I don't have more of that mentality, where it's like, as a therapist, I'm supposed to tell them what they shouldn't do, as opposed to have them see what they're ready for. And
right.
like, I like to think of things in sort of like a continuum or spectrum, as opposed to it being like right or wrong. And it's definitely been a change in my mentality over the years, because I feel like that was a bit of the formal education that we got, is like there's a right technique, there's a wrong technique. So it's like, I like to frame it as like relationships versus judgments, right? So like
Yes.
relationships are what you can always like point to, like a why in your discussion. Like if you're saying something is good or bad, well then let's like break that out and say like why, right? So because usually then there's a relationship behind that, which is not right or wrong, but like it fits in that whole relationship. But then you can usually find something that you can manipulate in that relationship to make that exercise or that thing no longer bad or no longer good, right? So then it doesn't become some inherent judgment of good or bad. It becomes something that there's always a relationship behind. And that fits, I think, nicely into this idea of a spectrum where it's like, okay, for the most part, it's like we have to just take baselines. We have to know like what your starting point is, what you're ready for. And then we have to have some standards for assessment to say like what's unacceptable, right? So like if there's pain and it hurts while you're doing it, well, we don't have to be afraid of that pain, but we might not want to pursue that exercise. But can we make it just a little easier? Can we turn that volume down? Now you can do the same category of thing, but you're just doing it in a way that you find safer. But you're in this process that says like in 2 weeks, you might be doing the thing that hurt you. But if you do something a little bit harder, now that hurts you, right? So then you're in this process, this continuum, which never has to be a judgment of anything, right? Like, but that doesn't sell all the time on Instagram, right? But it's sort of like, but I feel like it comes up more and more in like every field you talk to is like to get away from this, this extreme thinking and try to, be able to turn the dial up and turn it down and not think of it as an on-off switch.
Yeah, I love that you brought up the word judgment. Judgment leads to emotions, period, always, all the time. Judgment leads to anxiety, sadness, whatever it is, guilt, shame. I don't care what the emotion is. It always leads to some sort of negative emotion, almost always. Even if it can come with a little bit of positive emotion, it's probably going to come with some sort of negative emotion. So not only for our external pieces, our movement patterns, things like that, but also for that internal experience. How can I observe myself? How can I observe my thoughts? How can I observe my progress? How can I observe my movements? All of those things in the most non-judgmental way possible to decrease the emotionality in it and increase that objective piece a bit. And I'm not saying there isn't space for emotions, but what I am going to say, and this is one of my favorite lines, is all your feelings are valid, but not all your thoughts are true. Right. And we conflate those things sometimes in judgment. Those things really cross over. So if we can remove the judgment piece, then we can look at what our thoughts are in a more objective way and remove that piece that tends to lead to some pretty negative emotions that again get in the way of consistency and motivation. Right. No, it's a good piece.
As well said. And I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up today. But what I was thinking as a follow-up might be good is we can then touch on some specific things like chronic pain. Like we talked about the idea of it, but maybe we could touch on some like case studies along those lines. And then, any other kind of case reports that you would think would be useful to discuss while we're, playing out some of these models over time. And in the movement realm, but also in some of the behavioral psychology realm too. So maybe that's a good follow-up.
Yeah, to talk a little bit about chronic pain and the psychological component of chronic pain.
Yeah, so maybe we'll make that the next episode, and we'll kind of make that the specific topic of conversation there, because I certainly that's like the biggest thing that I deal with, even if it's in the fitness realm. And I'm sure like even if you're not the person supposed to be treating the pain, it seems like more and more now you have to be somewhat proficient in understanding pain if you're dealing with people from a movement perspective, because it's going to limit what you can do with them from a fitness perspective so much if you don't have some type of language there. If you're constantly just like afraid to touch pain and referring people out right away, then it's a detriment to the patient or the client, in my opinion, because it doesn't allow for continued progress to move forward. So if you have enough, you don't have to treat it, but if you have enough awareness of how you can kind of work with someone while they're in pain, it actually, I think, is better for their overall progress. So it'd be a good discussion.
We can also talk about the collaboration between providers too.
Yeah, 100%. And like we were talking about before, why sometimes the collaboration is so hard, because we're both taught, like you cannot go outside of your scope. And it kind of brings fear about where you're almost afraid to do anything without just pushing people to the next professional. But what that looks like practically is a lot of times you just feel like you're constantly confusing the patient or client, like they have to go to 100 different people where if there was a little bit more discussion in a more shared language, then there could be more continuity of care.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Megan.
Thanks so much.